All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, 1864, in the midst of the Civil War, in the run-up to the election of 1864, the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln gains a very curious supporter. During this month and through October, Emma Hardinge Britten gave a series of lectures stumping for Lincoln's re-election, mostly in California. She would give 32 lectures throughout the state, and in early November, Lincoln would carry California, be re-elected. Of course, a big boost for the Union cause. Lincoln would go on to preside over the conclusion of the Civil War early the next year. But back to the matter at hand, Emma Hardinge Britten, she's of particular note because she's not so much a political figure, but a spiritual one. Britten was one of the most prominent spiritualists, occultists of the era, and her seances, lectures, teachings, and more about the links between the spiritual world and the physical world were wildly popular at that time. So let's talk about the rise of spiritualism in the midst of the Civil War and whether an occultist is responsible for Abraham Lincoln carrying California in the election of 1864. A dubious proposition, but one that I can lay out as a question. Just asking questions. Here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, yeah, we'll get to the sort of political life of this very famous spiritualist. But, Niki, maybe can we just start with just during the Civil War, it does seem like there's a real resurgence of spiritualism, occultism, these larger questions, and I think search for some sort of something when it comes to the links between the spiritual world and the real world.
Yeah, spiritualism had been something that was present in the United States. It was a religion or a practice that was formed around this idea that you could pierce the veil between the living and the dead, and you could communicate with one another. And it had a following among middle and upper class people in the United States, but it was really with the Civil War, which was such an unmooring experience for so many people because the scale of death was so outsized. It was something most people didn't have any kind of experience with in this new kind of modern warfare. And people were dying far from home, and you weren't getting clear messages about was somebody alive or were they dead, or you'd hear they were dead and then they would show up. And there was just this real sense of loss and mourning and uncertainty around death. And you can imagine why spiritualism in that environment would absolutely thrive.
I completely agree. I think this is something different from like the first or second Great Awakening, where you have like a religious revival where it's sort of centered around like Christ's return or Christ coming back and rapture and all of this biblical prophecy. But this moment, I think, is different. People are really trying to connect to the dead. And so mediums and seances and being able to have moments where you either say final goodbyes or get closure, and having someone that boasts the ability to do that is so compelling to a lot of people who are in deep grief over the loss of their loved ones.
And it does seem like the search for answers, the search for connection goes beyond people just experiencing personal loss, but also, as we'll get into, I think there's even just political leaders are searching and feeling unmoored as well. And so this starts to seep its way into all the different facets of life. But maybe, we can tell a lot of this through the biography and a sketch of who Emma Floyd was originally her name, and then she becomes Emma Britten. She was born in England in 1823. Her father, Mark put it on the list, great names, Ebenezer. There are not enough Ebenezers in the world anymore. But Ebenezer Floyd, he was a school teacher, but he died early. She grew up supporting herself as a musician, an opera singer, a stage career, but then she really finds this sort of natural ability and this renown as a spiritual medium. And she comes to the United States and starts basically just conducting seances to help people get through, childhood trauma in many ways. Mm-hmm.
Oh, and she's a completely charismatic speaker. I mean, people are not just enthralled by her ability to connect with the dead, but they can't stop listening to her, which I think is really interesting given that most women during that time were shunned if they tried to speak publicly. And she's giving lectures all across the country. I believe a 32-city tour in which she's going from town to town, meeting with people, speaking, conducting these spiritual practices, and really drawing a crowd each and every time.
I think there's another piece of her biography worth folding in here, because she develops this reputation as a powerful spiritualist. But when she first came to the U.S., she held these seances because she wanted to show how gullible Americans were. Yeah. And then she experienced them and she was like, no, this is real. And I feel like that kind of true belief is something that's an important part of the story, because you do have people at the time like William Mumler who are just out and out frauds. Right. I mean, that's not to say that she was communing with the dead necessarily, but that they were really just manipulating people and trying to get money from them and trying to get fame. But she does strike me as someone who, came in with this plan where she was like, all you gullible Americans, and, had a bit of a conversion experience.
Yeah. And I think there's there's a worthwhile distinction there. I mean, it's hard to get a real sense of what her lectures were like or what being in a room with her was like, but I don't get the impression that it was like, oh, we're gonna bring a ghost into the room or you're going to be able to speak magical. I mean, a lot of her lectures have a sort of academic bent to it. She gives lectures like the philosophy of the spirit circle, what is the basis of the connection of the natural and spiritual worlds. Like she's not trying to just dupe people. She's trying to sort of explore ideas around spiritualism, I think, in a really compelling way, which makes this sort of transition into a political stance and activism, I suppose, really interesting. I mean, do either of you have a sense of how all of a sudden she comes around to becoming a Lincoln supporter and now giving sort of overtly political lectures as the election of 1864 starts to heat up?
Well, I will say this. I feel like there is a very direct line to spiritual leaders and political leaders that in a lot of ways, when you think about some of the abolitionists or some of people who even run for office, they're ministers first. And they have this religious or spiritual following that allows them to have a platform to speak about more political things. And I would like to imagine that this is also the similar thing is happening here. She has this following of people who are asking her real deep questions about spiritual life. And of course, it seems like that would translate also well into political life. Well, what do you think about leadership, or who's leading us, or where's the country going? And given the fact that the country is facing a civil war, people are having real existential crises about, will this country be divided? And so I think it's kind of a perfect opportunity for her to be able to take her gifts and talents and use them in this way.
Yeah, when politics is so viscerally and obviously about life and death as it is during the Civil War, it makes sense that a spiritualist would have something to say about where the country is and where it should go.
And so she's giving these lectures and thousands of people are showing up. I mean, it's kind of remarkable. And then, she gives one that has more of a political bent sort of in support of Lincoln, and it gets a great reception. And so then she's urged to give more. And then all of a sudden, over the course of this month of September, October, into early November, she gives dozens and dozens of these, to the point where the Union State Central Committee, which I suppose is a political arm supporting Lincoln, really starts to kind of back her and urge her, but they can't do so officially. And I think this is the really interesting thing here, is because obviously she's a woman, and Kellie, you hinted at it earlier, but women are not sort of usually in a position of this sort of public speaking, but it leads to this really fascinating thing where she is one of the most effective backers of Lincoln, especially in California, but she's obviously at a time when women are not seen as effective political actors.
Yeah, and largely responsible for helping him carry the state, which I think is incredible, given that, you know, so many women get marginalized in this period. Their contributions are never acknowledged, especially politically, in terms of how they can assist leaders achieve, you know, votes or their goals, especially when women in certain places are not voting either. I mean, it says a lot about her ability to influence the political landscape. And I think that's what, in this instance, what she's most known for is the boon that she gives to Lincoln.
Right, and the ability to reach a new and different audience, right? People who are coming to her lectures are probably not the same ones who are necessarily going to go to a straight-up stump speech. But then she's able to bring them along and encourage them for the 1864 election. And, you know, it's interesting to think about spiritualism, which actually it has a lot of cachet in the United States at the time, but it is still, it's not a fringe thing, but it is not as respectable as other practices. So you have spiritualism with a real hold in the White House itself, right? Mary Lincoln consults with the spiritualist after the death of her son in 1862, but it's still just like a woman speaking in front of an audience of mixed men and women at the time is considered a little suspect. So is spiritualism, right? And so she's violating a couple different taboos here, but effectively, right?
And I think because it's spiritualism, she gets more of a pass than she would if she were purely talking politics. So no one's going to allow her to come up and talk about, you know, like, I don't know, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, or like, you know, like battlefield tactics, or, you know, things that we just would not associate women talking about. But I do think there's something about religion and spiritualism that we also see a space where women can speak in some ways, in ways that they can't in others.
Yeah. But the diminishment of it, or and the sort of gendered lens through which people see it continues. I mean, you know, Nancy Reagan was mocked for consulting astrologers. And I think a lot of that was actually in the wake of the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, you know. So, I mean, I think it just goes to show, like, in these moments of deep trauma, people look for answers in all sorts of places.
And women are always like the fortune tellers, you know, every time, like, I mean, think about it in pop culture. It's always a woman with the tarot cards and, you know, or the medium who's telling you about, you know, your great-great-grandfather. Like, that sort of fits the stereotype.
So Lincoln, of course, reelected, carries California. This committee does sort of give a little hat tip to Emma Britten and say, you know, you really did help bring people out, and the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who saw your lectures really did help carry the state. Obviously, the next spring, Lincoln is assassinated in April. One other interesting coda here is that she is one of the first people to give a eulogy, and she gives another really long, epic, apparently deeply moving speech just in the wake of Lincoln's assassination, just about a day or so later. So there's this interesting just connection between the two. They keep weaving in and out of each other's stories.
And I wonder how long that speech was, because the speech itself was like a 28-page pamphlet. So, I mean, she's speaking for hours and has people really, really gripped.
Yeah, and it was recorded on a phonograph, so we know that it is it's a pretty accurate transcription of the speech. And it was, as Jody was saying, extemporaneous in many ways. And you can see both her deep affection for Lincoln, but also the sense that, the nation is going to be judged for this. She doesn't necessarily, she's known as a spiritualist, but she does make parallels to Christianity. She compares the murder of Lincoln to the crucifixion of Christ, seeing them both as these kind of unblemished savior-like figures, and uses that kind of Christian imagery throughout, which is, I thought, interesting to think about the context of spiritualism in relation to Christianity at the time.
Later in the 1800s and the 1870s, she becomes a sort of spiritualist missionary. She travels to Australia, New Zealand, and then she does die in 1899. The 7 defining principles of spiritualism, which are used by the National Spiritualist Association of Churches in the U.S. and in the U.K., those were codified by her. So she really was a sort of foundational figure in an ongoing line of practice.
I'd also say that one of her accomplishments is that she also establishes a spiritualist journal, The Two Worlds. And then her and another woman, along with several other members, they found the Theosophical Society in 1887.
I will add one thing, which is I do think we see some of these same strains today that we're going through a moment of trauma. And I think it's not a coincidence that in the sort of late 20th century and into the beginning of the 21st century, a time of upheaval, we are seeing the rise of spiritualism, the rise of astrology, all these sort of deeper questions, searching for answers in interesting ways. I do want to give a quick shout out to friend of the show, Harry Enton, who has a new podcast at CNN, and his first episode is actually about how the number of Americans who claim that they believe in ghosts has risen by 400% over the last couple decades.
What?
Yeah, and he explores an interesting stat with each episode. And so I have not listened to the episode. I will, but I suppose that I'm sure it gets into a lot of these similar things. That in a time of upheaval, we search for interesting things.
Election and upheaval, election and pandemic, and all in between. Wow.
Yeah.
I think we're going to need a third Ghostbusters remake.
There you go.
We're going to need something.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kaula Nakua helps with transcripts. Julie Shapiro is executive producer for Radiotopia. Get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments or ideas for the show. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com, where you can also get our full archives, transcripts, and learn lots more about the show. Follow us on social at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter, where we are posting stuff each and every day. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.